Welcome to Wellness with John, resources to help you thrive. I'm John Peters, and this is part two of what's going to be a multi-part series on Eastern psychology and Western therapy. I don't know how many parts they're going to be, but we will see. But in this video, I want to talk about one of the least understood but most important concepts that Eastern psychology has contributed to Western therapy, and that is acceptance and equanimity. So stay tuned and I'll explain. Okay, so in this episode, I'm going to talk about acceptance and equanimity, which I use relatively interchangeably, but I will explain those concepts in a bit. I've talked about this a little bit when I talked about acceptance and commitment therapy in the 7-part series on ACT. If you want to see that series, I'll put a link up here now. But part of what I mentioned in that acceptance and commitment therapy series was that Western psychology is built on the assumption that an attitude of acceptance is fundamental to good therapy. And that started with Freud. Freud thought if we didn't have this open awareness of ourself, we really couldn't do the work of therapy. So that's what acceptance means very broadly in Western therapy. And Freud's student Jung thought that acceptance was even more fundamental than that the lack of acceptance in one's life was really the source of neuroses. So psychological problems were fundamentally, according to Jung, a result of our not having an attitude of acceptance toward ourself and toward our life, which was why he promoted this holistic, deep kind of dive into psychology so that we could be balanced in all domains of our life and sufficiently deeply in order to integrate the parts of our life that we find golden and the parts of our life that we find challenging. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about what acceptance and equanimity means in Eastern psychology and how they take what I just said about Jung and Freud and actually significantly deepen what's available to us in the West and why acceptance is a component of things like ACT and DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. So let me start by telling you 3 stories. And these 3 stories all point toward the concept of equanimity. Then I'll give you a quick and clean version of how to understand equanimity. And then I'm going to talk about how it's relevant to you and me and people in general, okay? And some ways for you to pursue it in your life in order for you to thrive even more, okay? So story number 1 is one that you might have heard of because it's somewhat common. The other 2 you might not have heard of. The first story is like this. One day, a farmer is going out to plow the fields, but his main horse that he uses to plow the fields with runs away. And the villagers in the village gather around and say, "Oh, this sucks. What a disaster." And the farmer says, "Well, maybe." And then soon after that, his son finds a wild horse in the area and brings it home to tame it so they can use it on the farm. And the villagers say, "Great, good news, you're so lucky." And the farmer says, "Well, maybe we'll see." And so the son is trying to break the horse so they can use it on the farm. And in doing so, the horse bucks him off and kicks him and he gets injured, okay? The villagers gather around and they say, "Oh my God, that sucks." And the farmer says, "Well, maybe we'll see." And so then soon after that, there's this war in the region, and this local general is conscripting all the able-bodied young men into the army to go fight. But the farmer's son is spared because he's got this broken leg. And the villagers gather around and say, "Good news, you're so lucky, your son was spared from going to war." And the farmer says, "Maybe, we'll see." Okay? That's story number 1. Story number 2 goes like this. There's this general marching through the countryside, and he's so fierce that people, are scared of him and just don't even fight because he's so scary. And so the monks in this forest temple hear that he's in the region and decide to flee the temple temporarily while he's around and go hide. And yet the meditation master at the temple says, "You can go hide, but I'm going to stay here." So the general gets to the temple and he looks around, doesn't see anybody, marches into the main meditation hall, and he sees the meditation master sitting there. And so he goes up to him and he says, "Hey, don't you know that I'm the general who's so fierce I can run somebody through with a sword without blinking an eye?" And the meditation master replies, "I have heard that about you, but you should know that I am the meditation master who can be run through with a sword without blinking an eye." And in the story, the general throws down his sword and becomes a student, right? Story number 3. The novice monk goes in for his weekly check-in with his teacher at the monastery, and the meditation teacher says, "How is your meditation going?" And the novice monk says, "It's superb. It's going great, better than I could have expected." And the teacher says, "Why do you say that?" And the novice monk replies, "Well, the last few mornings, I go in and I sit down for the morning meditation. And shortly into the meditation session, this golden Buddha appears floating right in front of me." And the teacher replies, "Well, just ignore him, focus on your breath, and he'll probably disappear pretty quickly." So those are 3 stories that point toward this idea of equanimity, which has been a thing that has been identified and talked about in East Asian meditation literature going all the way back to even before Buddhism. So we're talking like 3,000 years of literature that identifies this concept of equanimity and talks about different ways to understand it and work with it, right? And in the context of East Asian Hindu and yogic and Buddhist meditation, equanimity is this feature that supports the realization on the path. And the goal on the path is, nirvana or enlightenment, right? Which on the surface might seem like it's not translatable to Western psychology, but I'll come back around to that. So the thing is that what equanimity really is, and this is the way we define it now in the West, is the ability to have a stable focus on something regardless of its emotional valence. So whether it's pleasurable or miserable, that you are present with it, you are focused on it, and you're basically grounded and stable, even if the thing is providing some chaos and turbulence in your life, in your experience, right? So not getting battered around too much by the turbulence of any experience. And that's not just for miserable experiences, but even positive ones. Because in the first story, there was the positive aspects of the situation as it was evolving, but the farmer was not getting battered around and seduced into the pleasure of the golden thing, like in the last story, where the teacher told the monk, "Just focus on your breath and that golden Buddha will probably disappear pretty quickly," right? So the thing is that, again, in Western psychology, we have this idea of acceptance, okay? But the reason that Eastern psychology provides some benefit, and this is one of the takeaways for this video, is that we tend to think about acceptance as just a state, okay? So like in this moment, in my therapy session with my therapist, I'm going to be in an open, accepting, present state oriented toward paying attention to, let's say, my emotions, because let's say my goal is to handle frustration better, okay? So if I'm going to handle frustration better, I have to be able to sit with my emotions. I have to be present with my emotions, even if they're challenging to experience and work with, right? So that's a state of acceptance. But what Eastern psychology gives the opportunity for is not only understanding that state, what is the quality of being in a state of acceptance, but what are the ways to actually build it? Because one of the things that's talked about in the ancient texts in the East is not only does equanimity exist, but equanimity is a byproduct of deepening your path, your progress. That if you practice and you practice in the right ways, you get more equanimity, right? So this is something that's extremely valuable potentially for you and for me and all of us, is can we not just learn what is acceptance, but can we learn how to increase our capacity to be in a state of acceptance? Okay? Because if we increase our capacity for equanimity and acceptance, then that's going to generalize and benefit us in lots and lots of ways, right? And maybe even beyond whatever the focus goals might be in your self-awareness, your wellness, your personal path, and your therapy goals. In life, we all need to increase our capacity to stay stable even when things are chaotic and turbulent and challenging for us, right? Now, one thing I want to point out, and this again is something that was pointed out in the discussion of equanimity in the Eastern literature, is that acceptance and equanimity is not apathy. Okay. Sometimes people think, okay, well, I want to be unaffected by something. And apathy is the state of being just checked out and therefore unaffected. But the cost of apathy is lack of richness of the experience. You may not be present centered on the experience, and thus you're cutting off lots of opportunities for what you can experience and how you can work with your experience. Apathy is checked out, and does it provide the benefit of being less affected? Yes. But in the first story, one mistake that people sometimes make in hearing that story about the farmer with the horse and everything is that the farmer was apathetic. And he might have looked that way from the outside if he was truly apathetic. But if he has equanimity, and we were able to, let's say we were Spock on Star Trek and we did the Vulcan mind meld on the farmer, we would find out that he's actually internally reactive. He is experiencing the richness of, let's say, sorrow upon learning that his son got injured by the horse, or glee when thinking, now I've got a horse to replace the one that ran away, things like that. So he actually is reactive, but he is not getting fused with the experience in a way that potentially makes him brittle and able to be knocked around by the experience. Okay? So it might look like apathy. It's not apathy. Apathy is you're not getting battered around, but you're also not actually experiencing the thing. Okay? So acceptance and equanimity are often considered in Western psychology, again, as states, but we don't do enough to think about how we reinforce that so that it becomes an increased capacity, or how we train people to actually change and get more equanimity, which is what I want to talk about now. So one of the things that is a product of not only the experimentation that people have been doing in the East for thousands of years with meditation, but the research that's been going on since the 1970s, especially starting in the 1990s in the West with meditation. The research shows that when people meditate, not only are they more in a state of acceptance and equanimity when they're meditating, but people who meditate fairly quickly start to show signs that they're increasing their capacity to be in the state of equanimity even when they're not meditating, okay? I've talked about this in other videos when I've talked about the rationale for why mindfulness practice is important. And this is the answer to why mindfulness is actually not the thing. Acceptance and equanimity is the thing, really, okay? But I'll come back to that in a minute. But the thing is, if you practice certain things, you can get more equanimity. So there are certain brain changes that have been demonstrated in the cognitive neuroscience research in the last few decades that show that the parts of the brain that we infer are implicated in the brain states that we associate with the state of equanimity, those parts are directly affected by the practice of meditation, if you're doing it right. And what this means is that on brain scans, they see changes in these brain parts when people learn how to do meditation, and even when they accumulate a relatively small amount, like 60 total minutes of practice, okay? You see more of it in long-term meditators than people who've newly learned it, but you get it after a relatively small amount of practice. But better than the brain scans, we see this in the function and the subjective experience of people who start to practice the right type of meditative experiences. And I've seen this as a therapist who has worked with thousands of patients over the last 25 plus years. teaching mindfulness as a component of the cognitive therapy that I deliver, I cannot tell you how many times, it's countless, how many times I have taught someone an easy to practice mindful breathing technique. And within a week to 10 days, they come back to me and say, yes, it's soothing when I practice, which is great. But then they tell me these other things, which is, since I started practicing, my friends notice that I'm more chill and I don't get as flipped out about things. Or my wife has noticed that I'm not getting angry at the things I normally get angry at. Or, I got triggered by X, Y, or Z, and I only got like 60% as triggered, and I calmed down immediately. I didn't stay upset about it. Things like that. Those are the things that are the evidence that when people start practicing, within days, they start increasing their brain's capacity to be in a state of equanimity, okay? And so that's why mindfulness is not the goal. I'm a mindfulness-based cognitive therapist. Why do I say that? Because I use mindfulness techniques in my cognitive therapy. And why do we say that in general? Because it's easier to say I'm a mindfulness-based therapist than to say I'm an equanimity-based therapist, right? If I put I'm an equanimity-based therapist in my profile, nobody would know what the heck I'm talking about, which is part of the reason I'm making this video, right? Equanimity is the thing. Mindfulness is a way to develop more of it, okay? So mindfulness is not the goal, all right? And maybe equanimity is not the final goal if you want to be perfect or a saint or enlightened or something, but equanimity is really more of the core thing that we want, because we can be mindful all day long, and that's great, but what are we really wanting out of our therapy? What are we really wanting out of our work on ourselves to improve ourselves and to cope better with the challenges of life? Part of what you want and I want and everybody wants is to be able to stay stable in circumstances that otherwise would bat us around too much, and thus A, be more miserable, and B, make us not respond effectively and get the outcomes that we want, right? So if you'd like to learn some easy to practice techniques that actually do help you build more equanimity, okay, and quickly, within days, I'll put a link in the description below to a free ebook that teaches you some things that you can learn in minutes, you can practice in minutes, and literally within a week to 10 days, I guarantee you're going to start noticing that brain fitness effect that you get, that is the evidence of your developing, deepening, and increasing your capacity to have equanimity in your life, right? So if you would like the free book to do that, check out the description below. And if you like this kind of content, feel very free to hit the like button below. Please subscribe to the channel. And I love comments because they help me craft the type of content that I produce for this channel. And if you have a friend you think would like this video, feel free to share it or post this video on your social media accounts. I love the exposure, right? So thanks for joining me today. I wanted to share this because it's a core concept that's important to all of us, even if we're not involved in Eastern meditation practices, or even if we're not involved in Eastern influenced therapy. All of us want to be stable and not batted around too much. All of us need more equanimity. I'm going to come back around to this topic in some other videos later. But anyway, this is part 2 of a multi-part series on Eastern psychology in Western therapy. Watch for part 3 in this moment. I don't know what the topic of that's going to be, but we will see. Watch the channel for more. Thanks.